Testament. I have my hat on loan. Just a little background. Some of you may already know, some of you may not. I got my bachelor's degree in preaching ministry. I got my master's degree in Near Eastern Antiquities, which is a fancy way of saying biblical archaeology. And I have a doctorate in theology. I have been to the Holy Land many times, the Middle East. I have hosted tours. I have been on archaeological digs in Jerusalem and in northern Jordan at a site called Abila, which was one of the cities of the Decapolis. The term Decapolis does occur a couple of times in the New Testament. So I like to see the Bible brought to life by things that have been found that help to confirm the message of Scripture. And you will see some artifacts on the screen and so forth, and I brought a few here you can look at later as well. And some of the artifacts we see may not directly pertain to Scripture, but they will pertain to the period of Scripture. And our study is going to be on the world of the New Testament. And let's see, here we go. And it's going to be 4 parts. And our first part is going to be from the Old to the New. And we'll be looking at the very tail end of the Old Testament. We'll be looking at the historical period between the Old and New Testaments, which is approximately 400 years. There's 400 years of silence as far as revelation from God between the end of the Old Testament, the book of Malachi, and the birth of Christ in the New Testament. And a lot of history has transpired. There's been a lot of change over the course of those approximately 400 years. And life in the New Testament is very different than it was in the Old Testament. We have different people groups. We have, for example, in the New Testament, we have mention of the Pharisees and Sadducees a lot, don't we? We also have mention of synagogues, and there are synagogues all over the place. The Apostle Paul went all over the world and would often visit synagogues. There's virtually no mention of any of those in the Old Testament. So something has occurred in this period between the Old and New Testament that ushered in some change politically, religiously, and historically. And we're going to look at those factors, and we're also going to be looking at some archaeological connections to help us get a better understanding of the world of the New Testament, the world in which New Testament events took place, to help us have a better understanding, perhaps, of understanding the New Testament itself. Now, in our second one, we'll look at the political context. Next week, we're going to be looking at from Roman Republic to Roman Empire, so we'll be looking at the Roman structure of things politically. Then in our third lesson, we'll be looking at influences within Israel itself. We'll be looking at the Herodian dynasty and Roman authorities in Israel itself. We've got Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, Herod Agrippa. We've got a whole dynasty of Herods, Pilate, and other sources as well. And then in our last lesson, I call it In the Fullness of Time, the Spread of Christianity. And you'll understand why I call it that in a moment, because we're going to look at a scripture that uses that phrase. And we'll look more closely at some of those groups I mentioned, like the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the Essenes as well, and how they came in on the scene. But tonight, we're going to look at this period from the end of the Old Testament into the New. Now, I'm going to jump here. I want to look at this passage from Galatians. In Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 and 5, "But when the fullness of time came, God sent forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, so that He might redeem those who are under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons." And it's that phrase, "when the fullness of time came." And so some questions that I'm hoping we will get answered in the course of this series are, why did God send Jesus when He did? Why not sooner in history or later in history? What was it about that time that made it the fullness of time? And we'll be looking at some of that as we set the stage for the world of the New Testament. Now, I want us to go back to the book of Daniel. In Daniel chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. Now, this is the same Nebuchadnezzar whose forces destroyed Jerusalem. They took all of Judah, the southern kingdom of Judah. They destroyed Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. And God's people were taken into captivity to Babylon. It's this same Nebuchadnezzar. And while in captivity, we have Daniel on the scene. And Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. And it wasn't just a matter of interpreting the dream. He also wanted his wise men to tell him what the dream was. So none of them could do it. But Daniel came and was able to explain the dream and its meaning. And the dream had to do with a statue, as we see one illustrated here. And with this statue, we have the head of gold, which in Daniel 2, it identifies who the gold head is. It says it's Nebuchadnezzar. So it's representing the Babylonians. And when you read, it talks about these kingdoms. And everything in the text suggests they're talking about successive kingdoms. And so we have the gold head, then we have the silver upper body, and the next empire to come was Persia. We'll be looking at that because the Persian Empire was the last empire of the Old Testament period among God's people in the Middle East. And then there was the girded around the waist, there was the bronze, and this would be representative of the Greeks. The Greeks conquered the Persians. And after that we have iron legs, and then down at the feet it's iron mixed with clay. And iron representing Rome. And I think when we get into our studies more about Rome, we'll see that even at the bottom, with the feet mixed with clay, Rome was weakened. It was divided into two empires. The Western Empire with Rome as its headquarters. The Eastern Empire with what would be called Constantinople, later Byzantium. Today it's modern-day Istanbul. The Eastern Roman Empire. And so we have these successive kingdoms. Now, some Bible scholars will disagree with me. And they will use this text in Daniel for eschatological teaching of end times. But to do it, the way they do it is they get down to the bottom section and they'll agree, we got Nebuchadnezzar the Babylonians, they'll agree with the Persians, they'll agree with the Greeks, but somehow we get down here and they think it's some future empire that's yet to occur. So we have these successive empires, and then we have a gap. Future, they're thinking, which I would disagree with. I think when you look at the text, it was meant to be understood, even at the time, that there would be four successive, or after Babylon, three successive kingdoms or rules that would take place. Now, we're going to look at the Persians. And the Persian Empire, just so you have a broad overview, went from eastern Greece, most of North Africa and Egypt. It included Israel and Syria, all of Mesopotamia, and even parts of western India. It was a very large empire. It was about as big as the Roman Empire, just different direction. The Roman Empire sort of went from here west. But this was the Persian Empire at this time. And it was a huge empire. And while in captivity, the Persians conquered the Babylonians. And under Persian rule, God's people were allowed on at least 3 occasions to return to their homeland of Israel. There were 3 returns of Israelites or Jews to Jerusalem during the Persian period. And we're going to look at some of these rulers, and a couple of them are mentioned in Scripture. But we've got here these rulers. Let's look at the first one. Cyrus the Great, as he's referred to, was known for his military exploits, but most known for his peace initiatives. In Ezra 1, verses 1 through 4, he issued a decree to set free captives and have the temple of the Lord rebuilt in Jerusalem. You can read that if you want to. That's Ezra 1, 1 to 4. He was also a very astute politician. He made it a practice to publicly worship the gods of every kingdom he conquered. So he sort of got in good with the people, locals. Keep in mind, and this is very important, it's strange for us, but it's very important. In the ancient world, polytheism, the worship of many gods, was normal. That was the norm. Not that norm. That was the norm. Okay? Now, if you just worshipped one god, you were considered off your rocker. You're considered crazy. And even in ancient Egypt, there was one pharaoh who tried to mandate the worship of one god. He wound up getting kicked out because that was just not tolerable among the people. So the worship of many gods. But politically speaking, Cyrus thought, well, when I conquer these people, I'll worship their god. They can still worship their gods. So he sort of tried to, make inroads with them after taking over their territory and so forth. So he often won the hearts of his subjects, and this greatly reduced the possibility for rebellion. Now, this is a clay cylinder, and it's called the Cyrus cylinder, and it's written in ancient cuneiform text. Cuneiform literally means wedge-shaped, and they would often take just a piece of clay and a stylus, like a stick with an angle cut on it, and just make these wedge-shaped symbols and diagrams, and that was their writing. That was their writing. Just as ancient Egypt had hieroglyphics, ancient Mesopotamia, including the Babylonians and Persians and Assyrians and many others, used cuneiform. They found this cylinder attributed to Cyrus in his many exploits. And it talks about many of his exploits and places he had conquered and taken over territory and so forth. Okay? Now, if we do a comparison of the text from 2 Chronicles to a portion of what's on the Cyrus cylinder, we see that there does seem to be some agreement. Many of the places that he would conquer, he would let them, you can still choose your religion, you're still free to leave or live in your home territory, and he gathers them together and restores their dwellings. Now that's a pretty broad description, but it fits in nicely with what the scriptures say. He let them return to Jerusalem and start rebuilding, as far as the Jews were concerned. The Jews weren't the only ones, the only conquered peoples that were allowed to return home and rebuild under the Persians. But in particular, those that the Babylonians had conquered, Cyrus and others allowed them to return to their homelands. And so we have this cylinder that gives us this comparison. Now, another of the Persian rulers was Darius. He's mentioned in Ezra and the book of Daniel. He found these earlier decrees of Cyrus, and he confirmed and reaffirmed permission for the temple of the Lord to be rebuilt in Jerusalem. Keep in mind, at the time some of the Jews went back, in the meantime, over the course of a couple of generations, other people were living in the area. And they didn't like it too well to hear that Jerusalem and its temple was being rebuilt. And so sometimes the work was halted because there was some violence. But with Darius, he reaffirms the order that had been given under Cyrus, and the rebuilding of the temple resumes. Now, he also introduced something else to which we are indebted to this day. Now, if you don't think history has an impact on the modern world, wait till you hear this one. What are these? Coins. He is the first to introduce currency on the world scene. There was no money before this time in the world. All economy was barter and trade. for goods and services. There was no money. And he got the idea from tokens. He watched how some cities would have tokens. Now, for example, if you have a large herd of sheep or goats, you can't take the whole herd to the market in town. What you would do is you would select some samples to take with you and have some servants out in the field managing the larger herd. And so you'd take your samples into town and someone would examine your samples and say, I'd like to have 100. Well, you only got 5 or 6 right there. I'd like to have 100. And they would make a token that would be taken to the servants, kind of like a receipt. And when it was given to the servants would count out however many it was. And he saw this token, which kind of looked like a coin. I remember years ago you had to buy tokens to play video games. Those various tokens. And they'd use these tokens. But they were only good for that city. Okay? So if you were buying sheep in Covington, but you went to Crawfordsville, your Covington token is no good in Crawfordsville. Each town had its own token system, a receipt system. But Darius thought, why can't we make an empire-wide currency? So that whatever I'm using in one place, I can also use that to buy goods or services in another. And so he was the first one to bring the idea of currency onto the world scene. And the Greeks and the Romans would really proliferate that idea in their empires as well. And even in the New Testament, we do have mention of coins, don't we? In the Gospels, for example, and so forth. They look at a coin whose image is on it. Caesar's, render unto Caesar who is Caesar's. Jesus told them to go to the sea, they found a fish with a coin in its mouth. Use that to pay the tax, the temple tax. So coins are even mentioned in the New Testament on a couple of occasions. So this introduced currency into the world. Now, how many of you might have some coins in your pocket right now? Anybody? A few of you. Okay. I've got a whopping penny. That's all I've got right now. But usually I have some change. I'm not too partial to pennies. I wish they'd just do away with pennies. It costs more than a penny to make a penny. Sounds like the government, doesn't it? But it's kind of nice to have some change, especially when you got to pay that little tax, right? You not have to break another dollar. You got a few pennies to make the difference. But we still have currency in that sense. So he brought currency onto the world scene. Now, Darius, in about 490 BC, launched a military campaign against Greece. Let's see, do I have... Yeah, here's my map here. Let me look at this. And so here we've got Greece. And this is Western Turkey today, or Asia Minor. This would have been part of the Persian Empire. Now, a little bit about Greece, and we'll go into Greece a little bit more later when we talk about Greece as well. But we have the beginning of the Greek-Persian Wars here with Darius, about 490 BC. And Greece was full of what were called city-states. Each city had its own king. Each city was its own country in Greece. And a lot of these cities would fight each other. Athens and Sparta were the superpowers in Greece. And if you formed an alliance, it was probably going to be with one of those two, either Athens or Sparta, because Athens and Sparta fought against each other. So it'd be like Covington's going to fight against Danville, but Crawfordsville is going to be an ally to Covington. Williamsport is going to ally with Danville, and we're fighting each other during the fighting season. And so all these city-states were independent. Persia thought that Greece would be easy piecemeal because it was not a united country. It wasn't a unified country with a centralized government of any sort. Every town was its own country, basically. And they thought it would be easy pickings. So they launched a battle at a place here called Marathon. Now, some of the Greeks, that's not too far from Athens, only about 28, 29 miles, I believe. Athens got a little nervous there, and some of the other Greek city-states, and so they tried to, they said the best way we can succeed is if we get them before they settle on the beach, because they were coming by ship in their navy. And so as they were unloading on the beach, the Greeks attacked. The Greeks were heavily outnumbered, but the Persians hadn't formed a beachhead yet to get settled. And it was kind of a rout, and Darius and his fleet had to retreat in disgrace. And the Battle of Marathon. Now, Athens was very nervous about this at the time. And a runner was sent from the battlefield to Athens. That's about 29 miles. And he comes to the city gates, where they found all the elders and leaders of the town, which was very common in the ancient world. Most of your business for the city was done at the city gate. They didn't have courthouses like we have today. They would meet at the city gate to have judgments or major decisions or great business. And so he runs, and he collapses at their feet at the city gate, says one word, and dies on the spot. But the one word he said was Nike. Nike was the goddess of victory. So by saying Nike, he was telling them, victory. We won. And this is where we get the idea to this day for the marathon race. So if you have various cities like the Boston Marathon or the New York Marathon or other marathons, it comes from the idea of this runner. Now, hopefully, all the runners in the marathons today won't drop dead at the finish line. But this is where we get the idea of the marathon race. Let's go on to Xerxes here in a second. Now, here's an image on a Persian wall. This is Darius on the throne, and right behind him is his son Xerxes, who's being groomed to become the ruler of the world in the Persian Empire. And so we're going to go to Xerxes. Now, we're talking about 486 to 465 for the rule of Xerxes. So he's the son of Darius. He's the grandson of Cyrus the Great. So we see a family dynasty that's emerging here among the Persian rulers. And he's also known as Ahasuerus in the book of Esther. You read the book of Esther, and the ruler of Persia is this Xerxes. Ahasuerus was his Hebrew name. Xerxes was his Persian name. So this same, here you see Xerxes, it's the same ruler we have in the book of Esther. So if you want to know more about the character of him in that regard, read the book of Esther, which is a remarkable story of a woman showing bravery and loyalty to her people to save her people. So this is the same ruler from the story of Esther. Okay, let's see here. Whoops, I go back. Now, about 480 BC, 10 years after his father was defeated at Marathon, Xerxes was going to take revenge against the Greeks. And he mounted another military campaign against Greece. Now this time, instead of attacking at Marathon, let's see, if I got my map again, let me go back to it. They're going to attack up here near Thermopylae. And he actually had his army come around. They built a pontoon bridge across this isthmus onto the mainland of Europe and marched around. Now, the Persians were accustomed to fighting in open plains. Greece does not have open plains much to speak of at all. It's mostly mountains and gorges and valleys and narrow passes. And so the Greeks selected their place to defend very good, the narrow pass at Thermopylae. It's estimated that the Persians had 500,000 men. The Greeks at this time at Thermopylae were led by a man from Sparta, a king named Leonidas. Leonidas brought 300 Spartans, But there were approximately 4,000 or 5,000 other Greeks from other Greek city-states who joined them, including forces from Athens. Remember, Athens and Sparta were fierce enemies. But on this occasion, they would be fighting against a common foe together. And that will be significant in later times. So a precedent is being set. But 500,000 against 5,000 or 6,000? Sounds like they're going to get whooped pretty bad. But what they did was they picked a very narrow gorge, narrow pass through here. That the only way really to get down here was through that narrow pass from where they were coming from the north. And so a small number of men can hold off a much larger army, because if the pass is narrow, you can only get so many men across through it at a time. And so Leonidas and his forces and the Athenian general Themistocles was in ships guarding the narrow pass here. So we have forces on land, we have forces at the sea, because the Persians were going to try to get some of their naval forces around and behind the pass of Thermopylae through these straits. But Themistocles from Athens had the naval forces blocking up the narrow straits. And so we have, for 3 days, these forces bottlenecking the Persians, and they couldn't go anywhere. Now, finally, by some betrayal of someone local or some Greek who went to the Persian side, told them about some obscure mountain trail that goes around and behind Thermopylae, and they used that to get behind them. Knowing this, Leonidas dismissed half or more of the forces to retreat so that they could, regroup and fight another day. But he, 300 Spartans, and about 1,000 Thespians remained. So they let the other forces sneak out. You couldn't get them all to sneak out, or the Persians would know that a retreat was underway. So they fought until the 3rd day, and then Leonidas, the 300 Spartans, and the 1,000 others with him were slaughtered at the pass. Eventually, the Persians came down and burned Athens to the ground. Totally burned it. Then there was another naval battle. Themistocles retreated the navy, and there was another naval battle near the island of Salamis, where the forces of the Greeks overwhelmed the Persians, and the Persians had such losses, they had to retreat again to Persia in disgrace. Now, Athens was rebuilt. And let me go back. Athens was rebuilt into what was called the classical era. Democracy was in its infancy in Athens during this time. And if you go to Athens today, and you go to the Acropolis, and you see the big Parthenon, that was what's left of this classical period that was rebuilt after the Persians destroyed Athens. Now think for a moment. Had the Persians conquered Greece, and they were very close to doing so, democracy would have been stopped in its tracks. World history could have been entirely different. And the Western world as we know it may not have even existed at all, because it could have been stopped at that point. So there's a lot of significant things that went on in this period between the Old and the New Testament. Now, the next one is Artaxerxes. And with Artaxerxes, he allowed the rebuilding of the temple under Ezra and the walls of Jerusalem under Nehemiah. You can go to Ezra and Nehemiah and read about those activities. Under his rule, we really bring a close to the end of the Old Testament, because the book of Malachi was written about 430, which would have been during the reign of Artaxerxes. Now, let's see. And this is a wall depicting some Persian soldiers, another coin. This is the tomb of Artaxerxes. Here's a relief of some Persian soldiers. Artaxerxes artists rendering what they think their ships may have looked like. There were triremes powered by oars, and they'd often, these don't show it, but triremes often had what looked like a battering ram sticking out the front, because they would ram their ships into other ships, or they would ram them against the oars and break their oars, and if you have no oars, you can't move, and you're dead in the water, which is not a good thing if you're in a naval battle. Here we got some archers and other things. Now, that brings us to the end of the Old Testament. What happened next? Well, we have the Greek period. And as I mentioned before, for a long time, Greece was not united. They fought each other. But there came along someone named Philip II of Macedon. And Macedonia, even today, is in the northern part of Greece. And Philip did something no one else could do. He unified the entire country. And there were two ways he did this. One was by force. He would conquer them with his army, or he would form alliances. So basically, you either made an alliance with Philip, or he would conquer you. But however he did it, he unified Greece, and his military machine just grew and grew and grew. So Greece finally became under one centralized form of leadership and government. There's one army instead of a separate army for every city. It was now unified. And he had in mind to pay back Persia and conquer Persia. And he had plans put in place, and he actually sent the first forces across the waters to Asia Minor for that purpose. Just as it was getting started, he was murdered at his daughter's wedding. Think about that. You don't really think of a wedding being a place for a crime like that, but he was murdered at his daughter's wedding. But that did not stop things, because his son was Alexander of Macedon, who would later be known as Alexander the Great. Alexander inherited this mighty army and force. That's the only reason he could even go and try to conquer Persia, is because his father had already put in place this mighty war machine which he could use. And he used it. And he used it mightily. Now, another thing that Philip, the Greeks used what they called hoplites. They'd be shields and spears, and they formed units. They did not fight individually unless it was a last resort. They would form these units, and they'd have a wall of shields that you'd have to go through. But he also, this is Philip here, the coin with his image and a horse. He came up with something new in military tactics and weaponry. It's called the sarissa. These long pikes, approximately 18 feet long, with a metal spearhead on the end. They'd have 8 rows of soldiers. The back rows would stick them up in the air, and it would camouflage or obscure the view of maneuvers behind the lines to the enemy. And the front lines, you had to get through that to get to the people. Now, if you only had a typical sword, which might be 2.5 to 3 feet long, and you're rushing that, who has the advantage? Well, the guy that can reach you before you can get to him. And that's what we have here. And so that was quite an advance in military weaponry and tactics of the day, and probably one of the reasons why he was able to unify Greece is because he came up with these new tactics that they were unfamiliar with in other places. Okay. Alexander the Great. As a boy, he was very enamored with the tales of Achilles. You may be familiar in Greek lore, ancient Greek mythology and lore of Achilles, who was a mighty warrior. He was part God and part man. He was dipped in the river Styx by his mother, who held him by the heel, and he could not die. He was impenetrable, except the one spot that didn't get wet, which was his heel. And he was a great military soldier and hero of the ancient Greeks. Alexander likened himself unto Achilles. And you know the story of Achilles, from which we get a phrase even today in medicine, Achilles' heel. It's because he was killed with either a spear or an arrow that hit him in the heel. That was the only mortal part of him, and it got hit, and he died. But Alexander was very much into the stories of the ancient Greeks, and especially Achilles. Now, his teacher was Aristotle. The great classical philosophers were Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And Aristotle was a tutor to Alexander the Great. And he acquired a love of learning, a love for science, but first and foremost, he was a warrior. And in 334, he began to fulfill his father's dream of the conquest of Persia. And he began that conquest, and it was very swift, a matter of just 3 to 4 years. They swiftly swept across Asia Minor and all the way to India, and pretty much took over the Persian Empire. Alexander never lost a battle. And I think he's probably one of the very few, if not the only, military general in history who never lost a battle in things of that nature. So he went even to parts of India where they encountered something they never encountered before used in warfare: elephants. They didn't even really know what an elephant was until they got there. And they were somewhat surprised to find out that an elephant is slightly bigger than a horse. And so that's as far as they got. It was Alexander's dream and hope to find the Eastern Sea. They knew there was a big sea or ocean to the east. They weren't sure how far. But he was trying to find what would amount to the Pacific Ocean. But he didn't get that far. But he did get to parts of India. Now, here's a coin with Alexander on it. This is Aristotle. And this is as far as he got over here into India. So he took over the Persian Empire very swiftly. Now his soldiers started grumbling when they got over here, because now they're getting outside of Persia into other areas, and they want to go home. They've been away from home for several years, and it's been a long campaign. They're ready to go home. And his forces were at times getting smaller. It's interesting. He was always outnumbered, but he always won, even against the mighty Persians. Now, they started coming back to head home, and somewhere along the line, Alexander got sick. Typhoid, yellow fever, we're not sure. But he had been sick before, he had been wounded many times before, and rallied himself, and that's why he was able to have such charisma with his troops. Even when he'd been wounded, he could rally himself from those wounds and be back fighting again fairly soon. But he died as a result of this illness or sickness. And it was only about a 3 to 4 year campaign from the time they left till his death, and he was approximately 30 years old at that time. Now, what happens to all this kingdom that Alexander conquered? They set up new Greek city-states in various places, similar to what they were familiar with in Greece. They would insert the Greek language and Greek culture wherever they went. We're going to talk about what's called Hellenism in just a few moments. But what happens to all this? Well, there was dissension among his 3 main generals for some time. And finally, they came to a somewhat reluctant agreement to divide the empire that Alexander had conquered into 3 kingdoms. And we have the Ptolemaic kingdom, which took Egypt and North Africa. And we have the Seleucid Empire, which took Syria and parts of Mesopotamia. And then there was another one that would take Greece, parts of Asia Minor, and Macedonia. So they tried to divide it up into three parts. And sometimes in history, these three kingdoms would then be fighting each other over territory. Of particular interest, if you have Egypt here, and you have the Seleucid Empire here, what's in between? Israel. Jerusalem. So it became a war ground, a battlefield area between these two kingdoms in later years during this period. Sometimes the Ptolemies had control of Judea and Jerusalem. Sometimes it was the Seleucids from Syria that had control of Jerusalem and Judea and so forth. Some of the accomplishments we have regarding Alexander the Great. He ushered in an age of Hellenism. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. He conquered half the known world by his death at 34, marched his men thousands of miles, never losing a battle, and became inspiration for many other military leaders like Napoleon. Many other military leaders would often look back at Alexander the Great as perhaps the best military example or genius to model, because he never lost a battle. And of course, every leader, when they're going into war, they never want to lose a battle. So they try to think of Alexander the Great. Now, after we talked about this division of his lands by his generals. Now, that brings us to the 2nd to 3rd century BC. Antiochus IV in the northern Seleucid Empire in Syria ruled and ravaged Jerusalem. He established a pagan temple at the temple of the Lord and put an altar of Zeus at the temple of the Lord. Sacrificed swine on the altar at the temple of the Lord. Now, do you think he's going to win friends among the Israelites and Jews by doing that? No. He was trying to subjugate them into servitude. And there are some who think this may have been a fulfillment or a partial fulfillment of a prophecy from Daniel 11 regarding the king of the north and what would be called the abomination that causes desolation. So here's a text from Daniel. His armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress, will abolish the daily sacrifice. They will set up the abomination that causes desolation. With flattery he will corrupt those who have violated the covenant, but the people who know their God will firmly resist him. But it's also referred to somewhat in the Gospel of Matthew. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand, and let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, if you read the context here in Matthew 24, Jesus had been asked a couple of questions, and in answering them, there were two issues. One had to do with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and the other had to do with the end of the age, the end of time. And when you read the text here, he doesn't necessarily answer them in order, the questions. But it does refer to an abomination that causes desolation. Now, at this point in time, and this is roughly 2 centuries before Matthew was written, so if the Gospel of Matthew is referring to the prophecy of Daniel here, that's sort of less likely that this was a fulfillment of it. Because Matthew's already saying it's talking as if it hasn't been fulfilled yet. However, there are some scholars, and this is disputed, but I tend to agree. I believe the abomination of desolation has to do with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD. Because it was destroyed, the Romans took it over, eventually the Romans put other temples there for other gods, and the temple of Jerusalem has never been rebuilt to this day. Now, there are some who refer to this abomination of desolation in eschatology and end times. And they see it as something future yet to be. But for that to occur, what has to happen? The temple would have to be rebuilt for the Jews. And it's if that is done, now we're going to have another war. Because on the Temple Mount today is the third most holy site in all of Islam. And that's the Golden Dome of the Rock. It's a shrine. There's also a Silver Dome Mosque up there today as well. I don't think there's any need for a temple because you and I, as God's children, are the temple. His Spirit resides within us. He doesn't need a temple built by stone. And I think at His death, burial, and resurrection, when that veil was torn, it was signifying man has free access to God now. And within the generation of the time Jesus was crucified, the temple was totally destroyed and it's never been rebuilt. And so I think it more than likely refers to that. However, I must concede that sometimes we have to look at prophecies. Sometimes prophecies may have dual fulfillments. So it's entirely possible, because this up here in 167 BC was probably the worst day in memory for the Jews up to that point, of the temple being destroyed and the abominations there, that God may have been foreshadowing through this event another similar event that would come when His kingdom would be put into place. So that's a possibility. So sometimes when we look at prophecy, we may need to keep in mind perhaps the intent was there could be dual fulfillments to help one that might be a typology or a preview of a greater coming attraction that may yet come. Okay. During this period, we have what's called the Maccabean and Hasmonean rule. For a little over 100 years, the Jews were an independent state and country. They ruled themselves during this intertestamental period. And as part of that, the temple was cleansed. It was rededicated in 164 BC. They had a celebration that lasted 8 days. It became known as the Feast of the Dedication of Lights, which is modern-day Hanukkah. Hanukkah represents the rebuilding of the temple during this period of time with regards to Israel being an independent state for just over 100 years. It's also during this time that we see new religious groups emerge that have not been seen before, but we encounter them a lot in the New Testament. And that's the Pharisees, the Sadducees, especially, and then another group, the Essenes. And we're going to look at these in more particular detail in our fourth lesson in this series. Now, Hellenism itself, remember our question, the fullness of time. Why did God send His Son when He did? There's some things, I think, that contribute to that. And Hellenism was part of it. The spread of the Greek language, because of Alexander the Great conquering most of the world at that time, and the spread of these city-states throughout the Persian Empire and much of Europe, the Greek language became an international language, much like English is today. You go in many places today in the world, and they may have their native language, but they also know English as a second or third language. You can still speak English in many countries today and understand people. Greek became an international language. So people would keep their own home language, but they'd also learn Greek, because it was taught in all these city-states around the empire. So we have a common language. That had not occurred, probably, since really going back to the Tower of Babel in the Old Testament, where there was one language, but a common language in much of the known world. Why might that be important? Well, isn't it easier to spread a message if a greater number of people can speak the same language? And what is the message of the New Testament, the gospel, to be spread? It makes it easier to spread a message if you write it in Greek, and the New Testament was written predominantly in Greek, so it could be used anywhere in the world. So that's one thing. Another thing that we're going to see with regards to this as well, with Hellenism, they blended the Greek, Egyptian, Babylonian cultures, with Greek being the dominant guiding force. And so the Greek language was taught in a lot of these places. They could still learn their local customs and cultures and keep that, but they added to it the Greek everywhere they went. So if you were in Egypt, you still had your Egyptian culture, but you also learned about the Greek culture. If you went to Asia Minor, you had your Asia Minor culture, but you also learned about the Greek culture. So anyone visiting from one kingdom to another, they could still communicate, and they had some common ground. Now, during this time, there were some other things that occurred in the sciences and philosophy, and I'm not going to go into detail on these, I just want to mention them. Aristarchus, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he was one of the first to come up with a heliocentric model of the universe, where the sun was the center of the universe and the planets went around it. Up to this time, most people in the world thought the Earth was the center of the universe. Everything revolved around the Earth. But he's the one that came up with that first one. We have another one here. Geometry. Go to textbook regarding geometry that is still referenced to this day in geometry circles and scholars. Okay? Archimedes came up with pi as a mathematical formula. I don't like him. I never got my slice of the pie right when I was in school. But anyway, he came up with pi as a mathematical formula. I was all right in math till they got rid of the numbers. When the x, y, and z came up, I go, what happens? Anyway. Zeno came up with the Stoic philosophy of Stoicism, which was became very popular. It was very common by the time of the New Testament. When we think of many of these philosophies, there are many others. Epicurean philosophy as well, where it was pleasure-driven. Eat, drink, and be merry. You know, if it pleases you, do it. Type of philosophy. But the polis. About an hour and a half from here, you have a major city called Indianapolis. What's polis mean? It means city. And with Hellenism, with this Greek culture, we have a shift occurring on the world scene. Because up to this point, culture was predominantly rural and agriculturally based. Now, it's still very rural, and agriculture is a large part of it, but there's a tendency and a trend to center things at cities now. Business, culture, events, the city becomes the central place in the world. So we have more and more cities being built. Theaters. Here's an example of a Greek theater. The Greeks and Romans built theaters all over Europe and the Middle East. You can still see many of them today. Some of them have been rebuilt and are still being used for concerts and festivals even today. If you go to Caesarea in Israel, they have restored one and they're using it for events. And many places you can still see it. The arts as well. Athletic fields, hippodromes. Anybody seen Ben-Hur? And the chariot races? That's a hippodrome. The chariots race around. Some of those are in Israel, all over the Middle East and in Europe as well. But they're always connected to the cities. And so we see this centralization being more urban, developing with this Hellenism. And here's a road. The Greeks built roads, and the Romans really proliferated it. The Greeks would build roads through the cities and maybe to a nearby town. The Romans put roads throughout the whole Roman Empire. So we get the phrase, all roads lead to Rome. And they had roads everywhere. Again, I think this is another factor that helps contribute to the fullness of time. Because if you have roads it makes it easier to travel, to take a message with you when you go somewhere. And so we have road systems all over the place. And no doubt, the Apostle Paul, when he traveled, he just didn't go over the goat trails from one place to another. He walked probably many of these Greek and Roman roads throughout the Roman Empire to get from one region to another.
And potholes in them.
Oh, by the way, this is at Corinth. One of the roads at Corinth, and this is the Acropolis. And at the top of it was the temple to Aphrodite, and some of the worship practice there was to engage with prostitutes. Just read the book of Corinthians. They had a lot of issues. Okay? Because they were in a town that was sort of like a New Testament version of Sodom and Gomorrah, if you will. It was very, very corrupt and immoral. And people who were coming to Christ were coming from that culture. And sometimes it's hard to get all of your upbringing out. And so some things may infiltrate the church when it comes to that. So they're still brothers in Christ, but Paul had some rather stern words for some things going on at the church in Corinthians. And he had to write them not just once, but twice to address some of that. Now, about 250 BC, some Jewish scholars went to Alexandria, Egypt, and they translated the Old Testament into Greek. It's called the Septuagint. And most of the quotes that we have in the New Testament that are Old Testament quotes are from this Greek translation of the Septuagint. In the book of Acts, you may recall, in the early days of the church, there arose a dispute among the distribution of food. Some of the Hebrew widows against the Hellenized widows. And they selected some men to address that issue. They must have addressed it pretty well because we have it never comes up again. But those selected, those 7 men, sometimes thought to be deacons, all had Greek names. They were Hellenized Jews. And 2 of them in particular, Stephen and Philip, we know about. And they're quoting some scriptures from the Old Testament. And they're quoting from the Greek translation of the Old Testament scriptures. And so when you look at the quotes that they're making, it falls in line with the translation that they had in Greek. So by the time we're into the New Testament, Greek, the common language, called Koine Greek, Greek of the common man, was everywhere. So we have a language that everyone could speak for the most part, maybe not perfectly, but enough to communicate, to spread a message. We had the Old Testament also in Greek, which tells a lot of the Messiah to come, does it not? So people who didn't know Hebrew could get a hold of the Greek of the Old Testament and be familiar with the Old Testament. And so we have that with regards to the Greek language. Now, there are many things that occurred during this intertestamental period. And we're going to look in particular later at some that pertain in the New Testament, like the Pharisees, Sadducees, and so forth. But that's just a broad overview. I mean, we could do a whole course just on the intertestamental period. But that gets us from the end of the Old Testament through this period of approximately 400 years between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, next week, we're going to look at the period of the Romans, from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. We'll be looking at Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, Cleopatra, Octavian, who would change his name and become Caesar Augustus. Does that sound familiar? We hear that a lot during Christmas season, don't we? Caesar Augustus issued a decree. Everyone should go to their hometown to tax, and that's why Mary and Joseph left Nazareth and went to Bethlehem. So Octavian is Caesar Augustus. And with Caesar Augustus, as we'll see, it brings a beginning to the Roman Empire, an end to the Roman Republic, and the beginning of the Roman Empire. And there's some really neat features about Caesar Augustus and the beginning of the Roman Empire that I think also comes into play as to another contributing factor for why that would be the fullness of time that God would bring His Son into the world. Now, I do have a few artifacts up here, and I see that my lamp has been burning. These are all real. These are not replicas. And I'll be bringing more each week. But these pertain more to closer to this period of history that we talked about. And the one that's burning here is an oil lamp from about the time of Jeremiah, Isaiah, and so forth. So we're talking about 800 BC. And as you can see, it's still working like a charm. And the one behind it is roughly from the time of the Judges or King David, from about 1200 to 1000 BC. I also have a figurehead here. It's just the head, but it's a head of a Persian with his garb and headset. And because we talked about the Persian, we talked about the Greeks. This is a Hellenized oil lamp. This is a Greek oil lamp from the Hellenistic period that we spoke about. And here I've got two juglets that go back, this one probably to about the time of Moses, to the period of Joshua and the Judges, and this one roughly the Judges to the time of David. And you're welcome to come up and look at these. Please don't touch. I might get into a panic if one of these drops and breaks, because I don't get to the Middle East every week to secure some. And next week I'll be bringing some from the Roman period. I'll have a Herodian oil lamp burning up here as well for you, and it's much smaller. Does anybody have a question at this point? Yes, sir.
What kind of fuel?
I'm sorry?
What kind of fuel do you use in those?
I'm using olive oil. Yeah. Came right from County Market. But olive oil. Olive oil was very common throughout much of Europe and Middle East anyway. It was already very common. And if you go over to Israel today, they still grow olive trees. And olive oil is still a very common thing. And it's used today for cooking oil, isn't it? But that's what's burning there, is olive oil. Yes, sir?
I read somewhere where the olive oil tree lived to be about 600 years.
There's some very old ones still in Israel today. They have some they claim to be 1,500 years old in the Garden of Gethsemane area that they call today. Some very old. They look pretty knotty. A lot very big and knotty, but they're still putting out. Anyone else? Another question? Yes?
The picture shows the road to Rome. It looks like cement that they used, but they didn't have cement then.
Yes, they did.
It is cement?
Yes, the Greeks and Romans invented it. They invented cement and concrete. And when we get next week, I'll probably have some images of some Roman aqueducts, which were made out of cement and concrete, as well as stone, for water to be moved from one place to another. Yes, they invented it. The Colosseum is made in large part from Roman cement and concrete. Great question. Yes.
Did they call in potholes like was on there too?
Well, let's see. I don't think it's too far back. There it is. Actually, that road looks a little better than a couple I saw in Danville a week or so ago. But yeah, these are cracked and broken. But there are some places where they're just stone. And they're in some places they're still pretty smooth. In some places they still use them. In some places, yes.
Just on that, you say how old them are. Of course, you was over there. How do you get one?
How do you date something?
How do you date it, or how did you happen to come across them?
For archaeologists, pottery is the thing, even if it's broken. Because pottery styles change over time. And as you'll see, there'll be very different looks of these lamps from an older period to a newer period. Pottery styles change with cultures. pottery styles change over time. And when they identify certain things, and if they find a layer of pottery, even if it's broken, and maybe they find something inscribed, writing is very critical to help date things too, because writing changes. Any living language changes. Look how English has changed over the last 200, 300, 400 years. It's very different than it is today. Okay? So language, writing changes. If I showed you what an original 1611 King James actually looked like, N's or V's, and S's or something else, the letters are even different. So the style of writing can give you a date range, probably within a century. If you find coinage, now you're probably within a decade. Because oftentimes the coinage would have the image of some ruler with it, with the writing. So if you find things in a certain level, the pottery is key in the style. I've got some broken potsherds I could bring, and I could show you just by the grooves on certain pottery. I say that's Byzantine pottery. And that gets it in a 200 or 300 year period. So pottery is a very key thing. So one of the reasons, and Michelle's alluded to this on a couple of our trips when I took some high school students, we'd go visit some sites and our guides over here telling them about it, and I'm sort of wandering off on my own. And I'm just sort of taking my shoe and just sort of kicking a rock over and kicking. Why? Because I see broken pottery just laying on the surface. I'm just sort of kicking something other. Hey, a handle. There's a pottery handle. The style of the handle can date things sometimes. So I sort of get excited with that as well. But pottery is a very key thing for archaeologists. And what I have here are very plain ones. Okay, there are some pieces that are so highly decorated and carved and ornate that it's just amazing. But these would be just common, everyday type of pieces that people would have. Any other questions?
Eddie, is there diggings going on every day, different locations?
Yes, there's all over Europe and the Middle East, every year there's excavations going on. Usually in the Middle East, the summertime is when it really happens for the most part. Most archaeologists are not paid as archaeologists. Most archaeologists maybe are professors at some college or university, either in Europe or the United States or somewhere else, and they have their summers off, and they can go over and participate in these archaeological digs and write their books and reports as a result of that. But in some places it might be year-round. I know when we went to Jerusalem last time in January, there was a dig going on there while we were there. But most of the time in the Middle East, it's in the summer. And usually, if you want to participate in one, and they like volunteers to come. If you're interested in participating in an archaeological dig, you can get information on the details of that, the expense, and what the living will be like. You're probably not going to be in a hotel. It might be a little more primitive living conditions. But you can do that, but usually you have to commit. Some of them at least 4 weeks, some of them 6 or 8 weeks. I would love to go on our archaeological dig again, but I haven't talked with the elders yet here to see if they'll let me be gone for 6 or 8 weeks at a time. Don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But maybe something will emerge where I could go visit one for a week or two or something. We do have some flyers available at both the connection station and back on the banister if you want to share about the next 3 parts of this series. Yes?
Yeah. Is a copy of this tape going to be available to view on the website?
Hopefully, if it worked. We'll see. Any other questions?
I'm interested in the oil lamps. What size are they?
Well, this one I could cover with my hand.
Say you had a party one night and you wanted more light, would you put in a bigger wick?
Well, you put in a bigger wick, you're going to burn your oil quicker.
How long does one of those burn, since they're so small?
Well, These little ones will probably burn for maybe 3 hours. Remember the story of the 10 maidens who had their oil lamps that Jesus told about? And 5 had extra oil, but 5 did not and had to go get it. They got into the middle of the night and they ran out of oil. Well, they were pretty small lamps. They were smaller than this one that's burning. And I'll bring a Herodian lamp next week, which would have been from the time of Christ. And you'll see it's not much bigger than that little one there. We'll have it burning. Of course, if you pull the wick out, the flame gets bigger, which means you burn more fuel quickly.
Burn up the wick too.
Yep. And so what am I using as a wick? Well, I cut off a piece of an old t-shirt.
What did
Rolled
they
it up,
make?
I made a wick. Pardon?
What did they make the wicks out of, you know?
Probably just rags or cloth. Kind of like I did. Of course, they didn't get that idea from me, but
If you're on one of those digs and you find something, can you keep it, or do you have to turn it in, or?
depends on what it is, how good it is, and how significant it is. If it's a museum quality piece, no. On a couple of the digs I was on, they found we had piles of stuff. Piles of stuff. Broken and whole. And some of it we could keep because they already, it was a plain piece. The museums had those. If it was a really nice piece, maybe had writing on it or some ornate feature, not likely. It might be that the director of the archaeological dig might be given a nice piece from the Department of Antiquities of that country as a thank you for doing the dig. But as a general rule, no. But if you're on a dig, they will have a discard pile that you can go through to keep some things. And then you have to have a note from the Department of Antiquities or the director so that you can get through customs with it. And in Jerusalem, there's still some places you can buy artifacts. You can go online and buy artifacts like this. And they will give you what they consider a certificate of authenticity, which may or may not be true, because anybody can print up anything and say anything. But it's still, to some degree, it's still a black market thing. Yes?
Did you find any of those?
These particular pieces, no. I think some of what I'll bring next week, yes. Mostly where I had been fortunate to participate in excavations would have been mainly the Roman and Byzantine period. It wouldn't have been much of the Old Testament period. And I've got a Roman glass vial that's broken on the top I might bring. Some of the colors still attached to it. And I got from one of the digs. I got some broken pottery. I've been involved in helping to discover the Essene Gate in Jerusalem. I was fortunate in Jordan to work at the city of Avila. The first year I was there, I got to get involved in tomb excavations and the survey of Roman water tunnels, which was a story in itself. So if we have time next week when we talk about the Roman period, remind me, and if we have time, I'll tell you about a couple of real fun adventures in a Roman water tunnel. Okay, we're getting a little long here. Let's. We have any prayer requests?